Hello. British fertility is in a state of collapse. This is not a subject you hear mentioned very often on the radio. Perhaps, for understandable reasons, we've spent so much time of late discussing deaths that we've missed a massive story on births, or rather, the lack of them. The pandemic saw a mini baby bust in much of the West. In Italy, 22% fewer babies were born in December 2020 than in the same month a year earlier. In Spain, the decline was 20%. In France, 13%. And it's happening here as well. Our fertility rate is falling fast. The replacement rate in a population is 2.1 babies per woman. In 2012, in the UK, it was already below that at 1.9. In 2019, it was 1.65. Last year, it fell again to 1.6. And now it's falling again to 1.58. This is a precipitous fall in a short space of time, and according to the ONS, fertility rates dropped across all age groups. What is going on, and what do we need to do about it? Especially when you consider how profoundly other demographic trends are already reshaping Britain's economy and state. The most recent budget makes very clear that much higher taxes are going to be a permanent feature of life because, to a remarkable extent, our entire government spending is being refashioned around the needs of old people. Spending is growing fastest in welfare, pensioners, and health to an extraordinary degree, and like much of the West, Britain is going grey fast. A big surge in the number of old and very old people is great. More grandparent love, more living history, perhaps less violence too. But combine it with a collapse in young people and, well, you do the maths. Fewer and fewer fit, productive workers to look after more and more elderly people. As the rather clever headline on a recent column by one of our contributors today said, Britain is turning into an elderly care system with a state attached. We are going to become a very different society, one for which the very, very few templates we have do not bode well. And on that cheery note, let me introduce you to our very distinguished guest. Professor Sarah Harper is the Director and Clore Professor of Gerontology at the Oxford Institute of Population Ageing. Miatta Fahnbulleh is the CEO of the New Economics Foundation. Robert Colvile is the Director of the Centre for Policy Studies, a Sunday Times columnist, and was one of the authors of the Conservative Party's election manifesto at the last election. And Professor David Runciman is the Professor of Politics at the University of Cambridge and host of a weekly podcast called Talking Politics. I know we've had him on previous episodes of Rethink, but he was quite good, so he got invited back. Welcome to you all. Thank you so much for doing this. Same question to all of you. Let's start with you, Robert Colvile. How will population changes, demography, reshape Britain in the coming years?
Well, I'll get the cliche out of the way. Demography is destiny.
I tried to address that in episode 1 and tried to unpick it, but I'm glad you've gone there. We can do the cliche.
And in terms of politics, in terms of the economy, in terms of the tax system, it's hugely important. So, as I said in the column you kindly mentioned, what's happening gradually is that spending on the NHS, spending on the elderly is gradually squeezing everything else out. It's now up to about 45% of day-to-day spending. It'll be above 50% soon, and that's because the number of elderly people is increasing, the cost of looking after them is increasing, and their political weight is increasing. So we are, as you said, left with a slightly awkward situation where we've got comparatively fewer workers paying more money to look after more elderly people. And you mentioned fertility. I think it's really interesting that people are suddenly starting to talk about fertility. Until recently, we've had an assumption that it doesn't actually matter that much because we can just import more workers and then send them home when we're finished with them. And then in 2016, something which happened, which made that which blew a hole in that strategy.
You could be talking about Brexit, which is related to demography. Miatta Fahnbulleh, you're nodding.
I am, and I go back to the economy, stupid. I think the impacts of changing demographics, the impacts of an aging population, the impacts of less young people will be slower economic growth. A lot of the evidence suggests that actually if your working age population is squeezed, who's driving your economy? And so this is a real problem. And up to now, you could have immigration as a strategy, but where we're seeing declining fertility rates across the board, you're going to have a lot of countries competing for people who can work, who can innovate, who can generate our economic wealth.
Don't give up hope just yet, guys. We've got another 40 minutes to go of this program. Professor David Runciman, same question to you. How will population changes, demography, reshape Britain in the coming years?
I think we already see that our politics is divided, old versus young, but it's not on the surface. I mean, it's not like there is an old person's party quite and a young person's party, not explicitly anyway. But those divisions are just going to widen, I think, as these changes kick in. And immigration is a good example of that. Elderly societies tend to be wary of immigration. Elderly societies need more immigration, and that tension is just going to widen. But there is an international context to this too. Where are we heading? Those figures that you gave at the beginning, we're not at the cutting edge of this decline. Countries like Japan, South Korea, Southern Europe, Italy, Spain that you mentioned, they're further along this path than we are. We'll be able to see some of what's coming. And in a world where our populations are shrinking, and other parts of the world population is growing massively, there is a global imbalance coming too. And we're going to see this over the next generation, and it's going to be much, much more visible on the surface of politics.
Thank you, David. Professor Sarah Harper.
I'm going to completely disagree with a lot of what's been said. This is not new. This has been happening. This is the demographic transition. We haven't replaced ourselves since 1976. We were one of the more balanced countries in Europe. France and us, we were pretty good in terms of age structure, and then Brexit came along. And actually, it isn't just that we have fewer migrants. It's just that one of the reasons why our fertility rate has fallen is that migrants tend to have slightly higher fertility.
Okay.
But actually, can I just come in? Because people have been unbelievably ageist about aging populations. Let's really put this in some kind of perspective. At the moment, you seem to be talking as though there's a certain age by which you stop working. We know that current cohorts of older adults and current cohorts going forward are going to be much more healthier and better educated and much more able to contribute to our societies. And this is going to happen across the 21st century. And actually, falling fertility is good. It's good for the planet, it's good for communities, and it's good for women.
Thank you, Sarah. Let's dig into the statistics you mentioned there for the UK picture. Can you give us a sense, please, of how British demography, UK demography, has changed over the past 30 or 40 years, both in terms of fertility, how many children on average women are having in the UK, and how the proportion of our population that is old is going to swell?
So in other words, as I said, we haven't replaced ourselves since 1976, and we actually kept well above 1.5. Many other countries didn't in Europe. They tipped below. The Nordic countries and Britain and France, we were, as you said, about 1.89, 1.9. And then when Brexit happened, that did have a really big impact, and we dropped down to 1.65 and now down to 1.58. Now, that means, obviously, that we have fewer babies being born in this country, and we're not compensating by migration. If we take the cutoff age at something like 60 or 65, it does mean that we will go from about 18% of our population over 65 to about 20, 25% by the middle of the century. But what does that mean? I mean, to be 65 or 70 nowadays has very little relevance to what it meant 30, 40 years ago. So as we are getting older populations, we're getting healthier older populations. And we know that the number of older adults who want to stay active in the workforce is continuing. We know they contribute tremendously to care. And I also think there is a little bit of myth about this politics. Brexit is true. We do know that older adults voted more for Brexit than younger ones, but the defining thing was education. And it just so happens that younger people have the advantage of being more educated, and older adults tend to have the disadvantage of not being so well educated. But the really key thing that somebody just said is politicians believe that people vote on age lines. And without any doubts, our politicians have been pandering to that idea that older populations tend to be more conservative and more right-wing.
And just before I bring in the rest of the panel, Sarah, do we know what impact, if any, COVID-19 has had on those demographic trends in the UK?
Yeah, really interesting. So there's just been a very fantastic analysis that's come out of the Max Planck, where they have looked at European changes during COVID. And you're exactly right. If we looked at what happened in the end of 2020 going into 2021, all countries dipped quite dramatically. I think Scotland went down to something like 1.3. However, a lot of them have come back, and we believe that that will probably be a temporary impact to the pandemic. Having said that, it is also possible that we will then have the economic impact on childbearing. And we know, if we look at, for example, the most recent recession in 2008-9, younger people delayed having their first child. And we may well see something about delaying having that first child. But until we get to the end of a completed birth cycle for a woman, which means that we look at women when they turn into 40 and 50 and stop having children, the long-term impact of COVID is actually going to be quite difficult to determine.
Okay, let's look at that whole impact of these changes on individual lives as well as societies, because Miatta, one of the statistics that I find most astonishing, largely because it reflects my own peer group, maybe your peer group, is just, as Sarah mentions, just how much later people are getting married now. So this is extraordinary to me. In 1981, when Prince Charles and Diana Spencer were married, the average British woman got married at 23.1 and man at 25.5. So in 2009, a generation later, just before Prince William and Kate Middleton announced their engagement, that had risen to 30 for women and 32.1 for men. Since then, over the past decade, it's grown so much further that today in the UK, the average heterosexual woman is married at 35.7 and man at 38. So in the space of barely a generation, in just one country, we've added an entirely new chapter to our lives, haven't we? One that me and my peers have lived through, your peers have lived through, Robert's peers have lived through, which is 12 to 13 years of unmarried life on average before having children.
Bliss. No.
Bliss or storing up trouble, or meaning not you don't have as many children as you otherwise would.
No, I mean, I think there's a positive side to this. A lot of young couples are choosing to get themselves on the career ladder to do other things before marrying, and I think that's part of what we're seeing in the numbers. And I think it's, as someone that got married relatively late as well, I actually think that it was a kind of positive choice for me. It isn't always, though, a positive choice. I think there are two sides of this, I think, which has a knock-on effect on what we're seeing in terms of fertility rates. I think that actually starting a family, of which the first step is potentially getting married, doesn't have to be, is difficult for some people. I think the economics of this, I always come back to the economics because I think it is a big driver. It means that, the cost of getting married, the cost of childcare, the cost of having children, I think can be prohibitive. And increasingly, I think we're seeing a lot of people delaying that because it's too prohibitive. And for me, the real piece in this is housing. So if you take the cost of housing, the average first-time buyer now needs to earn about 60,000 to be able to afford a home without relying on their parents. I think all of that has an impact.
Robert Colvile, and then I'll come to you, David Runciman.
Well, I was just going to say exactly the same thing. I mean, housing is home ownership among 20-year-olds and 30-year-olds has absolutely fallen off a cliff in the last few decades, while rising among the elderly, actually. There are some other factors. There was an interesting survey recently showing that claiming, I haven't seen the sort of evidence in terms of the fertility data, but claiming that more than half of young people are feel afraid to have children because of they think the planet is going to be destroyed by, and who would want to bring a child into this fallen world, which is, I mean, the complex of fear about climate change is actually, like according to, is massively overblown when you compare it to what the scientists are saying will happen on a realistic timescale. But obviously, I think the less secure people feel in every sense, the less likely they are to have families.
David Runciman.
I completely take the point that we can overblow this idea that politics is young versus old, not least because, as we've just heard, what counts as young is so varied. But it is also true, as well as demography being destiny, democracy is about numbers and majorities. And we do live in societies where there just are more older people. On some issues, that doesn't matter. On many issues, that's beneficial. But on some classic distributional questions, pensions, tuition fees, homeowners, renters, the nuts and bolts of government policy, it is the case that older voters tend to win. And we can argue, and probably we will argue, about whether that's a net good thing or a net bad thing. But there is, I think, a growing feeling among younger voters, and I think it will increase, people in their 20s, maybe people in their 30s, that the system is relatively disadvantaging them. And I think that is something that all politicians will have to take account of. You don't want an alienated older population, a disadvantaged older population. You also do not want an alienated, disadvantaged younger population.
That's fascinating. I'm going to come back to the politics and what the effect of all this on the British state is going to be in a moment. Just before we turn away from that, Sarah, it's really important that this question of how we've added new chapters to our lives, because life used to have about 5 chapters: childhood, adolescence, early adulthood, middle age, old age. Some people say it's just 3 stages: study, work, retire. But now, with people getting married later and living longer, we have, haven't we, Sarah, created, in effect, at least 2 new chapters: a decade of experimentation and perhaps freedom in our 20s, depending on your circumstances, what some people call the Odyssey years, and then hopefully a whole new chapter later on when you have active, healthy retirement.
That's very true. Am I allowed to go back and, just before I answer that,
Of course.
just very quickly clarify this thing, because I thought it was really interesting, this discussion about why people are not having children. And I think we have to distinguish between what we call temporary or postponement, and we know that economic factors are important there. But we still know that women typically adhere to the 2-child norm, but there's a difference in why women in particular want to have children. Those norms have changed, particularly among younger generations, and I think there's a much bigger emphasis on fewer children, good parenting, and high quality children. But to go back to the question you actually asked me, yes. But I don't think we should actually, divide it between the generations. We're seeing this real call for what we call fluid lifestyles. And what younger people want, they want to be able to mix and match education, work, maybe childcare if they have children. That's what midlife people want, and that's what older adults want. And so I think we are moving pretty rapidly, and definitely the pandemic has really brought this to the attention. We're moving to these fluid life courses. And it makes sense, actually, that you have younger people who want time to be able, as you say, in their 20s to explore and look at different kinds of careers. You have people in their 30s and 40s who may or may not be having children, and they want time to be parents. You have people in their 50s and 60s who are probably coming back to work, having brought up children. And then you have people even in their 70s who are fit and healthy and want to stay contributory. So I think we need to look at it as more as a fluid life course where we combine work, education, leisure, and care.
So fluid lifestyles and also longer lives, because Sarah, on current
Yes.
projections, how long will a child born in 2021, 2022 actually live?
Well, that's really interesting. I mean, some people say that half the babies that are being born at the moment will make it to a century. But I think the important thing is to say 2 things. One, half our population will make it to 80. But will that be healthy or will it be unhealthy? And there is a huge difference. And we do really need to look at inequality now. So we know that if you're a 65-year-old man living in one of our least affluent areas in the UK, you will probably live to 80, but probably all your 70s will be in ill health. If, however, you're an affluent man or a man who's living in an affluent area, you'll probably make it to 90 and you won't even go into ill health until you reach 80. So there is huge inequality in the experiences and the possibilities of older people to be able to remain healthy and contribute.
That's fascinating. So that's the impact of these demographic changes on individual lives to some extent. Let's turn to the effects on the social contract, on the state, and on our politics. Miatta, what are these deep trends going to do to the social contract, the unspoken deal, if you like, that unites the generations?
Well, I mean, I think if the evidence suggests that actually one of the big drivers of the sort of downtrend in fertility is economic context. When you've had a decade in which living standards have essentially not budged, wages have been stagnant, the welfare state has been eroded. I think all of that has increased economic uncertainty for people. All of that means that people are less willing, particularly younger people, to have children. And I think it comes back to that deal, the basic promise that generation on generation people were supposed to be better off. We have kids, we know that they're going to be looked after, we know that they're going to earn more than we are, we know they're going to have a better life than we are. That was the premise of the social contract. I think that has been eroded. And in the end, I think it does come back to the economics, because you have less people engaged in the labour market, and we then have a vicious cycle.
This is this idea that the best asset in many democracies is the future. And if you lose hope in the future, you lose something that's made a democracy possible. Robert Colvile.
Yeah, and I think some of this is self-reinforcing as well. As populations age, there's some good economic work to show that that debt tends to go up. up. I think it's like over a 50-year period, so every 0.4 years of life expectancy turns into 3% on the national debt, and we are growing. Life expectancy is growing at very much more quickly than that. But there's also good work showing that, as the population ages, interest rates tend to fall, and obviously this kind of exacerbates existing trends, because one of the reasons that we've had a housing crisis is that interest rates have been very low. People with money haven't had many places to put their money. They've bought second homes. I mean, in fact, one of my favorite statistics is that in the 10 years since the financial crisis, if we'd not built any homes but banned people from buying second homes, we'd actually be better off in terms of home ownership than we are now, because it's just like lots of people had lots and lots of money and parked it into property and displaced younger people. That said, what I'd push back on slightly is something that David's been saying about how this is inevitably going to play out in politics. I mean, it's true that old versus young is a huge divide, and it is a real driver of election voting behaviour, and even I think when you take education into account. But what's interesting is that whenever you try to explain this to the public, you fail and you lose. So every time I've seen people poll on sort of messages of generational inequality, or try to sort of pick a fight with people on this, it just doesn't happen. Like when they increased national insurance, you'd have thought that young people would have been storming the barricades. But there is a real sense, a really powerful sense in the electorate of generational solidarity. People don't see the elderly as them; they see them as my parents, my grandparents. And likewise, the elderly don't see the young as kind of this resentful mass. They see them as my children and my grandchildren. And I think that will actually take quite a long time to erode, even if the economic facts are much more much more dramatic than public sentiment.
David Runciman.
I completely agree that this isn't sort of Disraeli's two nations of the rich and the poor. Disraeli said living separate lives, separate universes, separate frames of reference. The young and the old share so many different parts of their lives. They live in the same houses. They listen to the same music. I listen to the same music as my kids. It's got closer together, not further apart. When I was a kid, I didn't listen to the same music as my parents. And the only other thing I'd say is on the social contract question, I think there is a really interesting issue here about who's responsible for the future. And I think I've felt for a while is there's something slightly odd about this sense. Again, it's more implicit than explicit that young people in politics are there to remind us of the long-term future. They're the ones on climate strike. They're the ones who are really making a fuss about some of the big long-term challenges that we face. To burden young people with that for being responsible for the future in political systems which do numerically tend to disadvantage them has always struck me as a little unfair. I don't think that means that I don't at all buy into the idea that somehow older people are selfish because they're not going to live as long. They don't care what's going to happen after they're dead. Of course they do. People care passionately about the future for their children and grandchildren. But there is a slight oddity to a politics where young people are sort of the spokespersons for the future in a system where real power and the ability to get things done doesn't tend to reside with them.
But isn't it reasonable, David, to say to them, get out and vote? I mean, because we're in a very vicious cycle, aren't we? I mean, maybe there's an alternative to democracy, which you've written about lots, and maybe young people would prefer an alternative to democracy. We have a democracy in this country, and the problem is we have this very vicious cycle, don't we? Young people don't vote, so they don't get the policies that could help them, so they get more disenfranchised, which in turn means they're less likely to have a good reason to vote, and you end up with what some young people that I speak to would say is Britain sliding towards gerontocracy, politics of the old, by the old, for the old.
Yeah, it is difficult, and it is true. Again, it's very clear. All the evidence shows that older people vote in greater numbers than younger people. I think a generation ago, and for reasons we've been talking about because of the demographic shifts, if you said to young people, if you all got out and voted, you would have a very different politics. If you say to young people now, if all the young people voted and all the old people voted, actually the old people would still win. The older people would still win. And so that's why it's a vicious cycle. Elections do keep going against younger voters. If the under 30s had been the electorate in the last general election, Jeremy Corbyn would have won the biggest majority in British history. If the over 60s had been the electorate, the Tories would have won every seat in the land bar 5. And we may not be talking about that, but that is a brute fact of British politics. And if you're under 30, there is a sense in which being told to vote makes you feel like you're being told to take responsibility for a system that does disadvantage you. so that you vote less and the system disadvantages you more. It's a real problem.
Robert Colvile.
I just say, I mean, Corbyn McDonnell is actually a really good example of this. They come to power as the sort of avatars of a youthful revolt, sort of, we're mad as hell, we're not going to take it anymore. All of the rallies in the original leadership campaign, and by the end, they're sitting there promising to preserve the triple lock, and they're focusing all of their and billions of pounds to waspy pensions. They kind of make this sort of realizing, oh gosh, this is where the voters are.
I've never had the Centre for Policy Studies and Jeremy Corbyn in the same ideological camp, but I'd have thought there is a sort of smart political point, which is you think there is a relatively untapped electorate here potentially, that if a party could get its act together and really mobilise those people, there's votes in it, right?
I think as David said, like the elderly are, the Tories
They still outnumber you.
They still outnumber you. I mean, one of the interesting things politically, I think, and because we started this by talking about fertility, is whether whether fertility is going to become a political issue. You see it in some countries. Hungary is throwing money at people to have children. In Israel, for sort of fairly obvious reasons, they offer you, basically unlimited IVF. There are some countries. I mean, France has sort of quite pro-natal policies. There are some countries where it's really sort of seen as a key part, a key thing to try and swell the population.
Professor Sarah Harper, you wanted to come in on that.
Yes, I mean, what I think is interesting is that, Robert's absolutely right. There are many countries that are trying to get women to have more children, and yes, they do increase a little one, but no country has gone over replacement rate. So in other words, you have to come back to what particularly women, but also couples want, and they want 1 or 2 children, and an increasing number are actually choosing to be child-free. And I think that's a really interesting trend. And it does come back to what we were talking about, young people, climate change, uncertainty, and people maybe this is the first generation who has not really felt an obligation to reproduce the family. And as a consequence, they are making those kinds of decisions. And I think, I completely agree with what David was saying, that we are, in a way, it's almost a political statement. It's saying, look at the state of the world, and I'm making a decision not to increase the population because I care about climate change or biodiversity, and I'm worried about bringing a child in. So I think, in a way, all these things are actually very linked.
Fascinating. Okay, just before we turn to what we do about all this, if we need to do anything at all about it, maybe that we don't, and we can happily live with an aging population forever. Let's just turn briefly, if you don't mind, from society and the individual to the state. Robert, in your Sunday Times column, which I mentioned at the top of the program, you wrote, and I quote, "There is a slow motion plot to destroy the low tax free market state, and the villain is the laws of demographics." Could you just explain that?
Yeah. So if you look at the shape of government spending in 1970 and compare it to today, and Duncan Weldon, I'm grateful to do this, spotted this in the OBL's latest statistics. What you see is it looks like Michael Foot won, not Margaret Thatcher. It look, you have in 1970 NHS spending is 3.4% of the total. In 2020 it's 8.4%. Defence has collapsed. Capital spending, which you kind of can think of as like spending on the sort of the seed corn for future growth, that collapses as well. This is the choice Rishi Sunak made at the last budget was essentially, if you have a choice between keeping taxes low, or not low, but keeping taxes where they are, and having headlines about NHS collapse in 2 or 3 years' time, you pay the money and you raise the taxes and you prop up the NHS, and that's been the story. The story of pretty much every budget and every spending round for the last 20 years is that the NHS always wins, and that doesn't necessarily mean higher taxes. It could mean higher borrowing. It could mean that you do what they did in 2010, which is basically you
cut spending elsewhere.
Cut spending elsewhere to protect the NHS. But basically, the share taken by the NHS kind of grows and grows and grows, and we could have a miraculous productivity improvements which suddenly transform the NHS in quite an ahistorical way. But fundamentally, we're probably left with a situation where we're trying to work out how to pay for this thing, and no one's come up with a solution yet, which doesn't just involve.
So in fiscal terms, is demography basically a bottomless pit?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, it costs. I mean, it's a very good thing that people are living longer, but if you were to die of a heart attack at the age of 60, it's obviously a very, very sad thing. But from the NHS's point of view, it's much cheaper than you living to 80 years old and developing what they call multiple comorbidities, where you have like 3 or 4 complicated things going wrong with your body, and you've probably got dementia on top of that. The cost of caring for an 80-year-old is 4 times the cost of caring for a 50-year-old, and we have a lot more 80-year-olds now than we used to.
I'm glad we got the phrase multiple comorbidities into this series of Rethink. Just before we come on to some of the solutions, David, I did want to ask you about the intersection between demography and geography, because there's an interest that I know you've podcasted and written about this, David, which is that the young and the old often increasingly congregate in different parts of the country too.
Yeah, and this gets back to the point that if you want to look at the electoral trends, age and education correlate closely. It's not totally clear what causes what. Are older people voting the way they are because they're old and they happen not to have gone to university, or is not having gone to university the key driver? But the huge expansion of higher education means that many young people have moved away from home and congregate in university towns, which now overwhelmingly vote Labour. I live in Cambridge, which is now a safe Labour seat. It used to be a marginal, a 3-way marginal. And it's young people who are driving that, but they are leaving behind parts of the country, which includes the blue wall, red wall, whatever you want to call it, where the constituencies are much, much older. And under our electoral system, our first past the post system, that does produce imbalances. Young people's votes do often pile up in certain places, leaving the constituencies they left behind to vote in different ways. And it does also relate to a point that Sarah was saying earlier when she talked about the fluidity of our lives and the way these categories break down. It's much harder to divide up our lives into these stages. And yet I feel that education is still not particularly fluid. I teach in a university, I give the introduction to politics course to the first year students. They're all still roughly the same age. They're kind of 18, 19. And I often look out at them and think, well, if you're going to live to 100, why are we cramming it in now? And that fluidity, which I think would be, and maybe we'll come on to this in the solutions, would be a benefit actually. If education is a big divider, we should have many more entry points and exit points from education across a life. A dream of the 60s and 70s, which somehow got replaced by the idea that what you just need is massive expansion for young people. The massive expansion for young people has created a more divided politics, and we need to get back to the idea that education is for everyone, old as well as young.
That's a really wonderful segue into thinking about the solutions. One of those solutions, Miatta, which I know the New Economics Foundation has talked about, is the retirement age. Is your basic view, I mean, in France, it's worth saying, in France, if you threatened to, I think some years ago, there were protests, weren't there, the prospect of the retirement age going from 60 to 62 many years hence. There is a cultural attachment in different countries to when you can retire, but the fact is we're living for longer. So do people listening to this need to know that they're going to be working till they're 70 or older?
I think we need choice in it. I think actually with an aging population, the point that was made that a lot of people are living longer and they're healthier. So why would they not work? And I think what we need is actually a labour market that's flexible. Increasingly, the old model of you go into a job, that same job, you're doing it for years and then you retire, just doesn't pertain to people's lives. People are moving in and out of jobs. There's far more fluidity. And actually, we need a labour market that can respond to that, so that there is an expectation that people work longer if they choose to, but people might want to change careers, they might want to do different things, they might want to go into education. And at the moment, if you like, we've got a 20th century model rather than a 21st century model, and I think that has to change. And for me, some of the underpinnings of that is much greater rights for people to be able to move jobs, much greater rights to know that when you do, you'll have security alongside that. I think we need pay levels that will allow people the confidence in order to move around, to be able to save, to take time out of work and then go back into work. And then I think there are some things that are absolutely critical. So, we haven't talked about childcare costs. And I think there's a major problem in this particular country. So the average person pays about 22% of their income on childcare. That's about double the average in other Western European countries. That is prohibitive. That is a problem. And I think if you can get we call for a universal childcare system, free at the point of use, so close to the sort of system you see in Scandinavia. If you can align that with lifelong learning, with wage rates that give workers confidence in the labour market, then I think you start to reshape the labour market in a way that works with a very different type of demography.
Professor Sarah Harper.
I completely agree. I mean, I think that's absolutely spot on. And the other really important thing is inequalities, because we're talking as though the biggest inequality is between generations. It's actually within generations. It goes back to what I said, and therefore, much of what we've talked about will pertain to a particular group within our society, and other people in our society won't even be able to recognize what we've been talking about. And the other thing I think, which is really important, was that comment that we're still using 20th century institutions and 20th century thinking. And the one thing that we haven't really spoken about is that I don't actually think demography is destiny, but demography does not happen in a vacuum. And of course, what else is happening in the 21st century? Technology. And the technological change that we're going to see is going to change our society out of all recognition. And a lot of the sort of economic thinking we have at the moment simply isn't going to stand up when we see how AI and the internet and all those kind of new technological changes are going to change the workplace. They're going to change how we live, how we communicate, and our health. And therefore, I think we have to stand back and say, make sure we are thinking in 21st century terms, and make sure that, in fact, we're changing our 20th century institutions.
Robert Colvile, what would the Centre for Policy Studies advocate as a way of preparing Britain for what everyone here agrees is a demographic change?
Well, I think there are all sorts of things you can do. I mean, primarily growth. If the economy grows, then a lot of our problems go away. But the problem is growth is very, very low at the moment, and productivity is very, very low at the moment, especially in the public sector, which is part of what we were talking about. I mean, I think tackling the housing crisis is obviously a big part of this, giving people the security of home ownership, which then plays out years later when they actually have the assets to pay for their social care. And we probably need to do something at some point about public sector pensions, which are not going to be very affordable for very long.
If they're affordable now. David, you got a pretty radical idea about some of this, which is on the voting age. You think children as young as, say, 6 should be allowed to vote?
Yeah, I do. No one seems to agree with me, but I do. I mean, it's partly because if you just look at the basic...
I have a 6-year-old. I'm not entirely sure.
No, I know. Well, I've had one. Anyway, the median age in the UK is roughly 40. I think it's a bit above 40. So it sounds like it's a pretty good point. The under 40s and the over 40s even each other out. And that's not the cutoff, but that's a sort of point at which you might say something shifts. But of course, among the under 40s, nearly half of those people are excluded from politics. And so it is unbalanced in that way, particularly as we get older and there's no cutoff at the other end, and there shouldn't be a cutoff at the other end. And however you think you should do it, whether it's voting or something else, there is a question here in an increasingly aging society, which is how you involve children, I think, in politics and decision making. And I don't think we do a very good job at it. We teach them civics in schools and we let them get on the school council and choose what they want for lunch and things like that. But I think there are lots of ways in which we could be more imaginative about that in aging societies, because aging societies, the shape of our societies is different. If young people feel excluded, we need to involve as many young people as possible. I just want to say one other thing about AI, because I think that's really important too. And I said at the beginning, we're not at the cutting edge of this demographic shift. Places like Japan are. There is a question here about, an almost sci-fi question about the future. Who is going to do the work as we increasingly age? And in societies that are resistant to immigration, some of them are pinning their hopes on robots. And there is a version, a sort of Japanese version of the future, in which it will be robots looking after the old people. And I don't think we're there yet, but there is going to be a question for all of us as to how comfortable we are with a model, a social model, in which the kind of work that there aren't the people to do, we're happy to be done by machines. And that has got something to do with demography.
Sarah Harper, was that a nod I could hear you expressed
a
there?
nod.
Or was it exasperation?
No, it was a nod from Oxford. I mean, I absolutely agree with what David has just said. And of course, it isn't older people, it's us. It's probably everybody on this program in 30, 40 years' time who will be caring for us. How will we be relating to our children? And I think the really big question is going to be the generational contract, how it's going to change. But it isn't just going to be demography that's going to change it. As David said, it is going to be things like AI, technology, robotics, how we as a society bring that in to help us in our daily lives and to care for all of our dependents. But I suppose the one thing we should begin to realize is that this demographic transition started 200 years ago. Across the 21st century, we are transitioning from predominantly young to predominantly old societies. And from the 22nd century onwards, we will have a much more balanced society with all ages. This is the century of transition.
Well, finally, Miatta and Robert, I mean, I feel like I've been speaking to people about this subject or commissioning or writing articles, leaders in newspapers about this for about 10 years. It doesn't feel like there's actually a huge amount of policy shift to address these problems, is there?
No, there isn't, and actually not even that much debate. The point on childcare, I still don't understand why that isn't the number one political issue. I don't understand why not enough parents are absolutely incensed that politicians have to respond. But equally, I think care. We talk a lot about a caring economy. I think increasingly our carers, both informal and formal, become absolutely critical, and yet our formal care system, you take social care, one of the least well-paid. Most jobs aren't even living wage jobs, people moving in and out of work because conditions are so terrible. And so I think increasingly, as our demography changes the nature of our society, our carers become absolutely foundational. And we need to start treating them as such and acting as such and putting support around that.
Robert, you mentioned that fertility might soon become a political issue. You started off by saying demography is destiny. If we all do start giving this subject, population, the attention it deserves, is demography going to end up becoming democracy?
Well, I mean, I think contrary to what you just said, I think some stuff has been done. Like the raising of the pension age was actually, surprisingly, it was very sensible, and it was also surprisingly uncontentious. Unlike France, we didn't sort of riot in the streets over that, and there is now an escalator built in, which should just about keep that in train, which is like removing one of the big drivers. I think we're going to face really big questions about the NHS, how we fund it, how it operates. I mean, one thing Sarah was saying just reminded me of when I was researching this, when I was doing tech journalism, someone sort of seriously proposing the theory that as AI and robotics get better, it will become increasingly attractive to have a robotic partner rather than a human one, because the robotic partner will sort of shape itself completely to your you'll never have an argument with the robot, like in that Scarlett Johansson film Her, and so that'll hammer fertility as well, as everyone just decides to settle down with their robots rather than.
That's even worse than what was your comorbidity phrase earlier? That's a suitably gloomy note on which to end, what's otherwise been a cheery discussion. Okay, thank you all very, very much indeed for joining us. I really appreciate it. What a terrific conversation that was. My thanks to Professor Sarah Harper and David Runciman, to Miatta Fahnbulleh from the New Economics Foundation, and Robert Colvile of the Centre for Policy Studies. Thanks for listening, and goodbye.
Sorry, I had to mention the robot.
You had to get Scarlett Johansson and a robot in at the end. That was terrific.
There's that bit in that film where she says, "Yeah, and I'm talking to 14,000 other people like this at the same time."
Yeah,
exactly.
Not a high point of a relationship.
Talk about showing their colours, huh? Did you all enjoy that? Oh, it's not. It's not what they said so much as how they said it. I suppose it's just one of those little things that they can, laugh about. Is part of the spirit of our times, when they can laugh in the face of the abyss. But what surprised me was the average age of women marrying, 35. But it means they're just going to have one child, right? Just one child? What quality parenting is it going to have? It'll probably be a bastard, right? A woman hoping to get knocked up after she's 30. She'll be sort of desperate, impatient, angry, bitter. She might get a fuck, but probably not a ring on her finger, eh? But a fuck is probably enough to impregnate her. What kind of man will she fuck after she's 35 to get herself knocked up so she can have a baby? Probably not the best kind of man, right? So you will have the spiritual ill health of a child conceived under these circumstances, the fact that it'll be a bastard and have two parents that would be technically considered sex offenders under Chapter 24, verse 2. It's not a good lookout, is it? And and what kind of children would that kind of bastard have? More bastards, even worse bastards, and eventually, yeah, I guess it will be the end of Western civilization. And I mean the end of civilization in the sense that to be a civilization, you technically have to have the organizational skills of city living, because civilization comes from the word Kiwis, spelled Ceves, which means citizen of a city. And that's an important distinction between, a peasant living in a village or tribes people in their, primitive tribes people, longhouses, mud huts, or whatever. Because as we all know, city living requires a more sophisticated degree of human organization than living in separate tribes in the countryside. But, with the emphasis on stupidity and bastardy, we'll soon be getting to the stage where we won't be able to manage city living because, well, all the more sophisticated things will be, I guess, taken over by these robots and AI, and then it'll break down, and I guess then nobody will know how to fix it because they'll be retards, right? They'll be retards after generations of ever-lowering standards of behavior and education, and they won't be able to fix anything, and everything will crash and burn, and there will be no people to start fixing things or growing things, and it'll be the end. So that's what we have to look forward to, people. Have fun.